My name is Jean Cannon. I am the curator for North American collections here at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. We are delighted today to have, in conjunction with our current exhibition, Unprecedented, speaker Heath Hardage Lee, who is going to reveal the mysteries of Pat Nixon for us this afternoon, based on her newest publication, which just came out this week, right? Just a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over for formal introductions. We have a lot of people in the room today. It's great to have you. We have a lot of people joining us on Zoom. Hi, Mom. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, please, feel free to put your questions in the chat because we're going to have a question and answer period after Heath's talk. So we'll get to as many of the questions, both in the room and online, as we can in the time allotted. I mentioned our exhibition that is in Hoover Tower right now. It is all about Watergate and Nixon, Unprecedented, Watergate and Power in America. It is open for this week only. So if you haven't seen it yet, this is your chance. It is going to be running every day, 10 to 4 until Sunday. So please step next door and enjoy that. We have wonderful archival materials covering this time period. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice just a little bit. We also have copies of Heath's book available. We're going to have those at the back of the room after the talk. We ask, please, because we have a lot of people here, to take just one copy per household. And if your staff, be kind and let our guests have a copy maybe before you take one back to your office. So, also, I wanted to let you know that this talk will be recorded. So it will be put up on our YouTube channel for the Library and Archives within a few days. So you can send it to your friends. And with that, I think that I will turn the podium over to Senior Fellow General H.R. McMaster, who is going to introduce our speaker. All right, thank you very much.
Hey, welcome everybody. I'm really excited about this because I get to introduce a fantastic person. Heath Hardage Lee is an award-winning historian, biographer, and curator who specializes in women's history, but she's also just a great empathetic person, and I think when you read her work, you can see her empathy in her work. She writes brilliantly in a compelling way, but also with a great deal of sensitivity to her subject. Her book that we're celebrating today is The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, The Life and Times of Washington's Most Private First Lady. And in it, Heath dispels a lot of kind of myths or misperceptions about her, and gets to really her really caring nature, her deep concern for issues of the state, diplomacy, but also for feminism and women's rights and so forth. So the idea of Plastic Pat kind of that image dissolves, as you read this fantastic book. But also, I'd like to recommend her previous book too. So make sure you buy that on Amazon tonight as well, which is entitled "The League of Wives: The Untold Story of the Women Who Took on the U.S. Government to Bring Their Husbands Home from Vietnam." It's a really compelling story, and as the husband of a military spouse who worked with her other military spouses while we were deployed to combat, it really was a story that came home to me, and I had the privilege of knowing Admiral Stockdale. That's another story I'll say for another time. It involves a hot tub. I'll tell you about it during the reception. Who was a fantastic person, and I got to know the family, and they appreciated you going to the dedication of the monument recently in San Diego. So what I really want to note is that Heath has made extensive use of the Hoover Archives for her last two books, and I think as a historian, don't you love archivists? I mean, we love archivists, and we have the best archivists here and the best archives here at Hoover. And what I think you'll find when you read this book is that it's a book that you'll want your whole family to read and discuss, because it's a book of love, it's a book of ambition, it's a book of influence, and it really, in vivid detail, it illuminates the time. As I look at demographics in this audience, most of us remember that period a little bit, some of our younger attendees maybe don't. But I think it really illuminates a really tumultuous time in American history, as does this tremendous display by our archives here. So, hey, without further ado, I know you want to hear from Heath. It's a real privilege to welcome you here. Please join me in giving her a round of applause.
Our society was not of one mind. Women were mostly, back then, homemakers, secretaries.
Women's Wear Daily has referred to you as Plastic Pat. Now, what's that kind of thing?
That was not who she was.
I enjoy what I do tremendously. I look over criticism very carefully and think maybe I should improve.
In political discussions, she doesn't say much, but you can always go to the heart from her. She's got an enormously good intuition. She probably is one of the most intelligent women ever to have been First Lady. She has been in the top 10 of the most admired women for years after we even left Washington.
What do you think people need to know about Pat Nixon that they do not?
She was a trailblazer. They couldn't stop talking about how good she was as a diplomat for the US.
Candid diplomacy.
Candid diplomacy, and that was Pat Nixon.
I wanted to talk about Mrs. Nixon's push to get a woman on the Supreme Court.
Pat Nixon was forthright about her desire for a woman on the court.
She was publicly pro-ERA, pro the Equal Rights Amendment, pro-choice before Roe versus Wade.
Pat Nixon's biggest legacy to me is what she did to advance women. Advancing women at that point in our history, in the early 1970s, is the major legacy of Pat Nixon. What a great example she was for a First Lady.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to that. I'm a museum curator also, so I'd like a really good orientation film. So we must have that to get you situated because I'm not going to have time to talk about everything about Mrs. Nixon today. First, though, I want to thank General McMaster for that wonderful introduction. I've interviewed him for both books, and he is also so empathetic in his approach and so helpful on Vietnam policies. So thank you for that. Also want to thank Dr. Neil Ferguson for his support, Jean Cannon, Samira Bazorgi, Hillary Weisfeld, and Kira Peacock for all your help today. So we're going to start today with the big question that you see in the title, the mysterious Mrs. Nixon. Why is Mrs. Nixon so mysterious? Why is she perceived that way? To many people, she was enigmatic. She was Sphinx-like. One writer called her America's political Greta Garbo. You may have heard her referred to by the very derogatory plastic Pat. There were rumors that she was reclusive and a heavy drinker during Watergate. That this is courtesy of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in The Final Days, which you may have read. After 4 years of research and interviews, what I found is that none of this was true. The real Pat that I found was nothing like the media stereotypes or the mythologies of Woodward and Bernstein or the Saturday Night Live skit. These are just media constructs. So the entire book is really an attempt to deconstruct what I found was a false or incorrect media image, but it's been held by for many years by Americans. So I wanted to dispel that so we could find out who the real Pat Nixon was. So first, I do have to start any book about Pat Ryan, who her maiden name was Ryan, of course. We must talk about her Western background. Pat Ryan was born in a very desolate little town called Ely, Nevada on March 16th, 1912 to Will Ryan, who was a miner, and Kate Ryan, who was a German immigrant. They soon moved from the miner's shack they inhabited their very tiny shack to Artesia, California, which is now Cerritos. By the time Pat was 17, both her parents were dead. She and her two brothers were really left to raise themselves. They were orphans. And she helped put these two brothers through college until she herself finally earned her turn to go to college. And she earned the equivalent of a master's degree from USC. She's actually the first lady to get a master's degree. Pat's future son-in-law, David Eisenhower, Eisenhower's grandson, told me in a wonderful interview that I did with him that his mother-in-law came from, quote, an Annie Oakley background. Her spirit is Western and California. She is not someone molded by the image makers, despite their many attempts to do so. She doesn't like that. She doesn't like hierarchy. She doesn't like media image makers. She has a real aversion to that. Now, due to our time constraints today, I'll be focusing on what I think are Pat's two biggest and most important legacies as First Lady. One of these legacies begins during her time as Second Lady. President Eisenhower is soon commanding his new Vice President Richard Nixon to, quote, take Pat when he goes really pretty much anywhere. Eisenhower wants him to take Pat. He sees what an asset she is, but he particularly wants Richard Nixon to take Pat around the world with him when he goes on diplomatic missions or reconnaissance missions to see what is going on in the world that he needs to tell his boss about. She quickly becomes a superstar diplomat for the Eisenhower administration. When she becomes First Lady in 1969, Pat has already had 8 years of training. I believe, and I say in my book, I think she is probably our best trained First Lady. By the time she gets there, she's done all this work as Second Lady, has done it all, seen it all, almost been assassinated in Caracas, among other things. So she is very, very well versed in foreign relations and diplomacy. When the Great Peruvian Earthquake strikes on May 31st, 1970, Pat is watching in her empathetic, sympathetic way. This is one of the first global disasters that is really on television for everyone to see. So it is quickly noted by the world that 70,000 Peruvians die in this disaster, 50,000 are injured, 100,000 are left homeless. So Mrs. Nixon immediately wants to help, and her husband supports her in this and suggests that she go as his solo global ambassador to Peru. This is another first, the first time a first lady did this kind of mission solo, a solo big humanitarian mission in a global environment. Pat's example of bringing tons of humanitarian aid, medical supplies, and money, and touring this devastated country in person, and by the way, wearing heels and a blue suit, which I think is another amazing feat that Pat Nixon accomplished. It's pretty amazing to see. She tours this country in person and encourages other nations to send aid, which they do. The other nations start following suit after she leads the way with that amazing image. In 1971, Mrs. Nixon is awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of the Sun, Peru's highest honor. So next, in January of 1972, Pat again takes on this role of solo global ambassador for the US when she goes on her husband's behalf to Africa. She goes to Liberia, to Ghana, and to the Ivory Coast. Another first, she is the first lady to speak to a foreign parliament there in Ghana. And then I love this image of her. She is wrapped by the native Ghanaian women in blue lapa cloth. So she dances with them. She charms everyone instantly and shows, how you use fashion diplomacy again, sort of wrapping herself in the cultural fabric of that country and participating in a joyful one-on-one way with those that she meets. And she does this everywhere she goes, all over the world. The next place she goes, when does this woman sleep? I really worried about her when I was writing this. I was like, Pat, please take a nap. I'm really worried about you. She really doesn't take much of a break. She goes very soon after Africa. She goes to China. This is a very, very famous trip. Some of you may remember seeing this on television. I think this is when her most famous diplomatic coup comes about, when she accompanies her husband to China, February of 1972. At this point, the reopening of communist China, this was after about 25 years of it being closed off. It's reopened to the West with this great diplomatic mission. And I think it's a major achievement for Pat with her soft diplomacy behind the scenes. She works with government officials' wives. She hangs out with them. She laughs with them. She has meals with them, tours all over the country in her bright red coat, which is a symbol of good fortune. And that, of course, plays very well on television. You're really following Pat. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger behind closed doors negotiating with the Chinese. So Pat is the face of the Nixon administration, and she is the one that you see. And then, of course, the other famous diplomatic coup during that famous trip is when Pat and the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, are at the table at dinner, and she sees this tin of cigarettes with pandas on the tin. And she goes, oh, I love those. I love those pandas. And the premier says, well, I'll send you some. And she says, great, and takes the pandas, a pair of pandas. Of course, I have my panda pin on, little swag from the Nixon store I had to pick up. So I've got that to represent panda diplomacy, which even now is still our barometer of relations between the countries. So I don't know if anyone noticed, San Diego just got a pair in June. So I just missed them by a week when I was there. But it's still the barometer. It's her panda diplomacy and the poise she shows that win her hearts and admirers everywhere. Soon after the China trip, Pat is off to Soviet Russia with her husband so he can work towards the signing of the ABM Treaty. Once again, her soft diplomacy with the Soviet leaders' wives behind the scenes makes all the difference. They all say they want peace for their children and their grandchildren, and they're going to work together with their husbands to make this a reality. So by the end of the trip, Richard Nixon has signed the ABM Treaty, and this begins the first stage of Soviet-American détente. Pat, again, is a huge part of this. She never gets credit for this. She never seeks credit for this, but it is a huge part of these dramatically improved relations between the former foes. If she was put on the spot, because Mrs. Nixon was very private, and asked what was her greatest legacy, I know that she would say it was her two daughters, not anything she did as First Lady. It would be her two daughters, Julie Eisenhower and Tricia Nixon Cox. These young women definitely were a big part of the reason for what I consider Mrs. Nixon's second great legacy as First Lady. Behind the scenes in the early 1970s, all three of the Nixon women began to push harder for women's rights, and they all became more vocal about this need. In this category, we had first the ERA, which they all supported, the Equal Rights Amendment, which I will have you know was part of the GOP platform beginning in 1940 until 1980. It was renewed every 4 years until 1980. Mrs. Nixon and the girls strongly supported the ERA and publicly supported it. And Mrs. Nixon was the first incumbent First Lady to endorse the ERA. Mrs. Nixon was also the first First Lady to use the word abortion publicly. That was a big deal at the time. She was also the first to disclose publicly that she was pro-choice, and this was even before Roe versus Wade in 1973. I don't think a lot of people remember that. And then from the time she was First Lady on, Pat always said anywhere she went in the world, she made it a point to uplift women, to recognize them, to meet with them, and to take their concerns and highlight them. And that is very significant. Now, here is the gem I found at Hoover. There's so many gems in the archives, and for both my two books, I have unearthed things that have made my books really, I think, stand out in terms of original new research, things we don't know about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of background on one of the literal jewels that I found about a woman named Jewel LaFontaine, who you may not know her name, but she should be much better known. The background on Jewel is that Mrs. Nixon began pushing very hard to get a woman on the Supreme Court, both publicly. She said to the media, "Don't worry about it. I'm working on getting a woman on the Supreme Court." She hardly ever made big public statements like that, but she did with the Supreme Court. And she was working privately all the time with her husband. You've got to get a woman on the court. We need that. As early as 1969, archival documents showed that Nixon was considering several women for the Supreme Court. And among them is this Chicago lawyer, an African-American woman, Jewel LaFontaine. Ms. LaFontaine was the first African-American woman to graduate from the University of Chicago Law School in 1946. She became prominent in Republican politics. And the photo you see here of Ms. LaFontaine is from the 1960 GOP presidential nominating convention, where she seconded Nixon's nomination. She had acted on the campaign as Nixon's civil rights advisor and was very, very instrumental in advising Henry Cabot Lodge and Nixon about these topics. So in 1971, 2 Supreme Court slots opened up. You might remember Mildred Lilly's name. She was the woman whose name rose to the top, but her candidacy was leaked and promptly quashed, not by Nixon, but by the American Bar Association. So I apologize if we have lawyers here, but the ABA was not the good guy at that time. Mrs. Nixon was furious about this. She believed the ABA's veto of this candidate, which led to Nixon, not pushing it anymore. She believed that was sexist and unfair. She kept pushing him, and boy, was she mad at him. He was terrified. He called John Mitchell, his attorney general, and said, "What am I going to do? Mrs. Nixon is so mad at me." And then he called Julie and said, "Your mother is so mad at me. What am I going to do?" So I think he was always a little afraid of Mrs. Nixon and what would she think. So that whole oral history that Julie Eisenhower has about that is pretty interesting and entertaining. But only recently, when I was at the Hoover Archive in 2022, the John D. Ehrlichman collection had come to Hoover, and my good friend Jean Cannon alerted me that they had this and I should come see this. So that was all I needed to book my plane ticket. So I spent days going through the collection, and here I found this gem, a memo a little bit later. So this is after 1971. We have 2 male justices, of course, that get those slots. But a memo from December of 1972 with the heading "List of Black Women for the Supreme Court" with LaFontante's name was there. The Nixon tapes from the date of the memo matched the notes that I found in the Ehrlichman collection at the Hoover Archive. On the tapes, Nixon says, quote, "It's going to be a Black woman. I've decided that. It's exactly the right way to handle 2 problems." So that was so exciting to find the memo here, to correlate it on the tapes with the help of Dr. Luke Nichter, who spoke here not long ago. He was a huge help. And Nixon mentions LaFontante twice on the tapes for Supreme Court role. Now, the disappointing part of the story is, of course, we don't get a female Supreme until 1981, when Sandra Day O'Connor is the first female Supreme Court justice. And it's not until 2022 that we get a Black woman, Ketanji Brown Jackson, as a female Supreme. However, the seeds of gender and race equality on the Supreme Court are planted by President Nixon, with Mrs. Nixon pushing for this behind the scenes, wanting no credit in the early 1970s. The other parallel story I found to Mrs. Nixon, and this is also part of Mrs. Nixon's push for women's equality, is this amazing woman, Barbara Hackman Franklin. She, at the time in the 1970s, when she comes into the Nixon administration, she is a recent Harvard Business School graduate and a banker. She is recruited by a Harvard Business School friend, Fred Malek, who is part of the Nixon administration, to be staff assistant to the president. What was her job? Well, her job was to identify and recruit talented women for mid and high-level government jobs. Mrs. Nixon pushing for this also behind the scenes and quietly supporting Franklin's efforts in this area. Franklin developed what she called a talent bank, and this identified many future female government stars, including Sandra Day O'Connor, found by Barbara Franklin and identified, Carla Hills, Juanita Krupps, and many more. Franklin's efforts also ushered in an era where we had the first female FBI agents, tugboat captains, forest rangers, and sky marshals. By 1972, the White House had almost tripled the number of jobs for women in policymaking positions and had promoted 1,000 additional women into mid-level federal jobs. That is the second part of her legacy that I think is outstanding. And I really don't think anyone really knew this to begin with. Again, because Mrs. Nixon, one of her faults is that she would not take credit for things. She did not like the spotlight. She didn't want to take credit. But when you're someone's biographer, you can do that. I can take a little credit for her. Now, this is a really fun part of the story, and it correlates beautifully, I think, with the exhibit that I had the privilege of seeing this afternoon right before. So you might recognize the Germans, John Ehrlichman again and Bob Haldeman. During the Watergate era, the media dubbed Richard Nixon's two closest aides that you see here, the Germans. So White House counsel and then Chief Domestic Advisor John Ehrlichman, Harry Robbins, known as H.R. Haldeman, was Nixon's chief of staff. They were called the Germans, also Hans and Franz, also the Praetorian Guard. I mean, I have like a huge, the Siamese twins. I mean, I could go on and on about it, but the nicknames that they had play on the men's Germanic last names, but also their militaristic style, and particularly H.R. Haldeman. They were accused of building a, quote, Berlin Wall, isolating the president from his family, his old friends, and political allies. And indeed, you see a transition from the old Nixon team in the early part of the Nixon's career up through about 1960. Then the new Nixon team comes in with Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and many young men who mostly come from the advertising world. So I say it's a bit like Don Draper taking over the White House from Mad Men. And that's kind of what it reminds me of. You can read about that in the book. So the East Wing staff, they've formed a lot of the core interviews. The women on Mrs. Nixon's staff that I interviewed especially despised Haldeman and resented his efforts and attempts, along with Ehrlichman's as well, to take over and control East Wing operations. These moves were firmly put down by Mrs. Nixon's. Things like they tried to take over the East Wing correspondence and then just tried to take over the whole East Wing and put it under the West Wing. And Mrs. Nixon said, "Dick, that will not be happening." And they tried to give her a male chief of staff, and she said, "I will not have a male chief of staff." So Mrs. Nixon was fully capable of looking out for herself. When the Watergate scandal begins after the DNC break-in in June of 1972, Mrs. Nixon, her daughters, and the East Wing staff are minimized and shut out more and more as this affair explodes. Eventually, President Nixon fires the Germans. Pat, her daughters, and the ever-loyal Rosemary Woods, Nixon's long-suffering secretary, is now the executive assistant to the president, and they are quite happy the Germans are gone. And then they hunker down to fight what Nixon staffers called the last campaign. However, as we all know now, the last campaign proves to be a lost cause. On August the 8th, 1974, by the way, exactly 50 years ago today, Nixon resigns on national television. The next day, on August 9th, 1974, Richard and Pat Nixon will hand over the roles of President and First Lady to former Vice President and Second Lady Gerald and Betty Ford. As they depart, as the Nixons depart on the presidential helicopter, Pat murmured, "It's sad. It's just so sad." But she doesn't cry. She has a core of steel. I found that Pat Nixon was a remarkable First Lady, and I believe her to be one of our very best. She left behind many important contributions, but her two biggest legacies remain her critical and skillful international diplomacy and her push for women's rights behind the scenes. In the final analysis, I think her three most defining characteristics are her Western pioneer, do-it-yourself, anti-hierarchical point of view, her poise, which was legendary, which allowed her to keep calm and carry on during all the many storms of political crisis that she and her husband were buffeted by. And the last, her refusal to quit, even when the odds were greatly against her husband. But I'm not going to leave it at that. I am going to let Richard Nixon himself tell you how Pat was always the last to give up. So Marshall, let's roll that last piece.
Very quiet about it, listening to the others, which she usually does. But she came down very emphatically against resigning. I mean, we have to remember that during the fund crisis, I was the one that felt that, well, I ought to give my resignation to Eisenhower. And she said, you can't do it. So you can't do it because of its effects on the children. You can't do it because Eisenhower lose the election. He says, these people are just dumb who think that if he does this to you, that they're going to be able to survive and get your supporters to support them in the final campaign. And on this occasion, she was a fighter to the last. She was the last to give up. She was the last to give up in the fun thing, the last to give up in 1960, and she was the last to give up this time. Very hard for her.
Thank you so much for your attention. I am happy to take questions from the audience and also questions from the Zoom audience if they would like to submit them. Yes.
What happened in 1980 that the ERA was no longer on the GOP platform?
Well, that I think is under Reagan, so it is out of my purview. That one I can't comment on all the specifics, but I do know, at one point even President Nixon was thinking about dropping that, and Pat said, "No, you won't," and he did not. But yes, so we have to ask the Reagan scholars about what happened.
We have a Zoom question. I think this is in regards to the video at the end. What was the fund thing that Nixon?
Oh, yes. Oh, and I have a huge chapter about this. The fund crisis. Does anyone remember the Checkers speech? Okay, so the Cocker Spaniel and the fund crisis is what Nixon staffers call, what most people will call the Checkers speech. So this is in 1952. When Nixon is hoping to be Eisenhower's vice president, and he is accused of having a secret fund to fund his lavish lifestyle and also Pat's decorating. This is a complete lie, smear. He has to, or decides to go to kind of gamble it all, go on national television, and he goes through every single bit of income that this young couple has, and it isn't a lot. And reveals all their finances. And at the end, he says, that's all we've got. We're honest people. The only thing we're keeping, there was a Cocker Spaniel named Checkers that our daughters were giving, and we're keeping the dog. So that's the famous, line from that. So that is also known as the fund crisis. And Pat said, you absolutely cannot give up. We are staying on the ticket with Eisenhower. He'll lose the election without you, which was probably true. And our children would never be able to live with that. She's always thinking about the daughters, about the family. And he says, I don't think I can do it. I don't think I can go on TV and do this. And she holds his hand and says, yes, you can. And then she is on that televised, if you look at the fund crisis speech, she's sitting on the set with him as he gives the speech. So it's a fascinating sort of story about how she never gives up.
I have a question. Have you find anything interesting about the trip that the Nixons took to Spain in 1970? I was a little ago, and I think that trip was very significant to open the then dictatorship of Franco to the international global world.
Yes, well, you will know more than I. I only sort of skim over that trip in the travels that they have. But yes, I think just the example of being there, of and being such a presence, and of course, Mrs. Nixon is just out and about, and doing her behind the scenes diplomacy, usually with the wives of the government officials. I can't speak to that very specifically, but it's interesting. What do you remember as a child about that? Like on television, I'd be interested to know, or what you saw.
Yeah, I remember I was probably, I don't know, 8, 9, and I remember going down the streets in Madrid in an open car. And I remember my parents saying, cheese, Nixon, well, they didn't say cheese, but Nixon, come and see the president of the United States is coming to visit Franco. So, I remember shock, I guess, a little bit.
Yes. Yes, that's an interesting. Yes, I'll have to research that some more now. That's interesting. Sure.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
for such an amazing summary of the book. I'm a Peruvian international student here,
Oh, wow.
so I was especially interested in
Oh.
hearing Mrs. Nixon's role in shaping the response to the 1970 earthquake in Peru. When I learned it back home when I was 12 years old, they always highlighted the role of America in leading international response, and that was Mrs. Nixon right there.
Oh my goodness.
So thank you for that highlight. My question is more on the legacy of Mrs. Nixon for the rest of American first ladies. To what extent would you say that she, having been the most traveled first lady for many decades, changed the way the role is perceived?
Oh, excellent question. And I love that you're here. That is so neat, because that Peruvian trip was amazing. And Peruvian government officials said Mrs. Nixon did more for Peruvian American relations than anyone in 100 years. I mean, that was really an amazing trip. In terms of first ladies today, your excellent question about that. So, Pat Nixon is one of those first ladies I think that people have forgotten or not really ever known. And so, one of the things I hope the book will do is show what a role model she was, particularly for foreign diplomacy, these travels to Peru, all over the world. First ladies need to do that so that we are modeling the one-on-one, the cultural exchange, the relationship between the countries. And she did so much behind the scenes to facilitate things. So I do think first ladies that study her, those that are conscious of that, look at that and her global warmth and this embrace of other cultures. I think that's something that those in the know take away from her. That was really her number one thing, was just meeting people where they are and a warm embrace of global cultures. And I think very ahead of her time. I mean, this is in the 70s when people really just didn't travel like that. So I think there's that. I don't think people are as aware of her push for women's rights behind the scenes, but I hope now they are, and I hope they'll take that away and apply that. But it's interesting to think about, like, what do other first ladies look at? What do they see as models? And I do have a number of quotes in the book about that from the Bush administration. So you'll have to read and see some more about that. But thank you. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
In my younger days, I viewed Nixon as being very divisive. And I'm curious as to, in your study of Mrs. Nixon, whether she tried to work against, try to help him with that, or whether she was part of that. By the way, since then, I've studied a lot of history, and I think he was less divisive than I thought back in those days. But I was very able to be swung by the media, I guess.
Understand. You would not be the only one. Certainly. I mean, he's still can be seen as a very divisive figure. I think Pat was his best political asset. And I think she did a lot to smooth that over. She was the most admired woman in the world in 1972, and she made the top 10 for most admired women in the Gallup poll 14 times. Amazing. And then when even after Watergate, when they go into exile, she continues being in the top 10 most admired women. And that gracious way she had, Watergate didn't really seem to tarnish her image at all. And I think she did a lot to smooth that over. I think the unfortunate thing is the West Wing did not see Mrs. Nixon as the asset that she was. She could have been used, and again, these are PR guys. There's no explanation that makes sense to me on that. These guys should know what a huge asset she is to Nixon, humanizing him, making him more accessible and more because he was a devoted family man. And I do not think his staff did a good job in terms of using Mrs. Nixon to his advantage. She also didn't like to be used as a prop. So that there was that conflict, and she didn't like to be in the spotlight. So, she sometimes doesn't help her own image, but I think the staff didn't use her properly because when she was with Nixon, it balanced things out. Like on these foreign trips, I think that's a lot of the reason for his success is her demeanor. So, interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I was just wondering the sources of the documentation for this book of yours. I mean, was there private literature or private letters, this type of thing as well?
Yes. Oh gosh. I mean, my editor was like, please stop footnoting this. I mean, it is a ridiculous amount of footnote. They don't want to pay to print the paper. So I think it was more about that. Extensive footnotes. Of course, Hoover, I used extensively, the Nixon collections. Pat has her own collection. There's a pre-presidential collection and the presidential collection, but then a lot of personal letters, things, for instance, the World War II letters between the Nixons. I didn't have time to talk about the love letters between them, which are very, not steamy, but they're just so passionate. You're like, wow, it changed my whole concept of the marriage. And it really did. I was like, oh my goodness. But many of those had sort of not been shared with the public, and the daughters allowed me to see some new letters. Both of the girls gave me new things that no one had ever seen, and those make a huge difference. And then, of course, I did extensive oral histories and interviews with the East Wing staff, with Barbara Hackman Franklin, with a lot of the West Wing staff that are still around. So it's a combination of archival, of personal letters, some diary things, not for Mrs. Nixon, because darn it, she didn't keep a diary. We wish always for diaries, but she was private. She didn't want people to find her letters and diaries. She herself, was very careful not to leave a lot of traces, which makes my job a lot harder. But peripherally, there were many documents, letters, lots to go on. So you'll have to look at the book, but there are more footnotes than you will ever want to go through. So, yes.
Heath, congratulations again on a tremendous book, and thanks for this great presentation. As kind of a follow-on to the last question, could you talk a little bit more about the creative process generally and how you write? You've given me some good advice.
Oh gosh.
About scenes and how to bring the reader into the most consequential part of that scene, or what the overall point is from the beginning. And then also maybe talk about the creative process as a curator, and now that you're working on a television series, and maybe what are the similarities and differences between your writing, curating, and now working on film.
Oh my gosh. Well, I would never presume to give advice to General McMaster about writing or anything else. That's very kind. But we did have a wonderful conversation, I think, when I was interviewing you about Nixon Vietnam policy. And by the way, there are wonderful quotes and insights about that from General McMaster in this book. I think with that process, one thing that I think is really important to make it readable is context. And this is what is so lacking in so many books I read. I try to really get into the periods, material culture. This is a curatorial thing also. The clothes, the music, what are people eating? Where are they traveling? What Rolling Stones song best illustrates this part of the chapter? I have a bad tendency to use a lot of Rolling Stones songs in my books, to illustrate, just gratuitously probably. But I think building context, the Vietnam War, which, this was a wartime presidency. This is so critical to the Nixons and their world. So I think that's all very important. And the crossover with curating an exhibit, certainly, again, the clothes, the music, the background, the ephemera, like the Watergate exhibit, I thought this is fantastic. A major shout out to Ms. Peacock for her excellent work and everyone else that was involved. It's just, incredible things, cartoons, all of that, the taping system. In terms of a television series, I would love advice from anyone in that business because that is, oh my goodness, that would take a lot of wine and drinks to even talk about how that works because I'd like to have some creative control, but one really never knows, if you option these things out. But I am working on a television series for the League of Wives. I hope it will eventually be on a channel where people will watch it, but I am learning about that. So I am open for advice. Any film directors here, please, would love to talk to you about that. Thank you. Yes.
I'll combine two questions.
Sure.
The first is what was her relationship with her husband, and the second part is what was her life post Nixon's resignation.
Sure. Well, the marriage again, I think was constantly attacked in the media as loveless, as they were isolated from each other, etc. And again, I did scores of interviews with people who knew them, as well as people like Air Force One, people, babysitters, people kind of outside. That's not what people saw. But remember, even Jack and Jackie Kennedy, they're never physically affectionate with each other on camera. We're not in the Instagram era where we have to post all how much we love each other 15 times a day. Yuck, it's kind of yuck now, but it was really yuck then. Like Jack and Jackie, no. Richard and Pat Nixon, no. That wasn't how they were raised. But, I saw a lot of moments behind the scenes where he would hold her hand behind a campaign podium, or, he wins, I think it was the 68 election and twirls her around in a pirouette on Air Force One. These are sort of the moments that are not on camera. And the World War II letters, as I said, and the courting letters are just unbelievable. That is a Richard Nixon I don't think many people have ever seen. And then my favorite story about when they're dating is that Pat makes Richard Nixon drive her to dates with other men in LA. And I'm like, that is cold. Like, that was really she made him work really hard for, to win her hand. So eventually, he pursues her, he's smitten, she falls in love with him. And then I do think, and I talk about this, there are points in the marriage, and I think anyone who has been married, there are times when things are not going so well, when he is working constantly, when she is exhausted with childcare. And there is a point at which the relationship really frays a bit during the time, I believe it's in the early 50s, where they have a Jesuit priest who acts as a bit of a marriage counselor to them. And then, of course, Watergate, they're so overwhelmed by that. But David Eisenhower told me he saw them. The narrative was that they were very estranged during Watergate. He said, I saw the opposite. This is when they really came together to sort of fight the last campaign. Once they get rid of Haldeman and Ehrlichman, which I think was the big irritant in that relationship for a long time, that isolation, the minimization of Mrs. Nixon, they come back together. And then in exile at Casa Pacifica later, it's like the relationship just comes back around and they're very sweet with each other. He brings her roses, he fluffs her pillow. He's always trying to bring her little treats and do things to please her. So it's a nice circular kind of back to the beginning at the end, before sadly all these health crises kind of overtake their lives. But they're proud grandparents and they adore those grandchildren, get a lot of good time with them. So a long answer, but it was a very long marriage. So any other questions?
What was her relationship with Mamie Eisenhower?
Oh, yes. Another favorite
And I
topic
have-
of mine
have
is the
second
Mamie
one. I have a
Pat.
second one. There's a two-part question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
That's one part. The other part is, what was the reaction with the girls during Watergate?
Gotcha. Well, I will start with Mamie and Pat, which is a very interesting relationship. It doesn't start off well because of the fund crisis that we talked about, the Checkers speech, when Eisenhower's kind of, indecisive. He's going to see if Dick Nixon can dig himself out of this hole that he's in before he says, yes, this is the vice president, the one I'm running with. So Pat is really pretty upset with the Eisenhowers at first. I think maybe more so than Richard Nixon, who, knew it was politics and I think didn't take that quite as hard as Pat did or as personally as Pat did. But Mamie quickly, they warm up to each other very quickly. And Mamie is very kind about inviting her to the White House, about having her to all these different functions. And she soon is introducing the Nixons at the White House as our dear friends. So the relationship, Pat is wary at first, but Mamie charms her. Now, Mamie also often gets Pat to stand in for her. Mamie also is a first lady that I would not say is as much of a working first lady. That's one thing to answer the question that this young man over here asked. Pat is a first lady who is like a career first lady. She works and this is her job. Mamie is more of a figurehead first lady, and Mamie really likes her sleep. She likes to sleep till noon. Because her esthetician has told her she won't get wrinkles if she sleeps till noon every day. And she loves As the World Turns, and she makes her staff watch it with her every day. You would not catch Mrs. Nixon watching soap operas or ever staying in bed past 7:30. So they're very different first ladies, but the role was evolving into more of a working role with Pat, with Mrs. Nixon. Now, the second part of your question, the daughters, and so what they knew during Watergate, how they reacted during Watergate. What I think, based on my years of research, I think Mrs. Nixon, Julie, and Tricia were all minimized, were all shunned aside by a lot of the West Wing, particularly Haldeman, Ehrlichman to a lesser extent, and they were isolated. And that Berlin Wall that people talk about, I believe that was true. And they were really isolated from President Nixon, from the inner workings. They had none of them, I am convinced, had any idea what was going on with Watergate. They were concerned, but they were reading what everybody else was reading in the press and really did not have a lot of insight. As you know, Julie was out there, defending her father. She would do as many as 6 events a week. Tricia was more in the background. She was more of the quiet diplomatic supporter in the background, but Julie was very out front about that. That's what I think based on the research, based on the facts that I saw in terms of what they knew, which was nothing that I could find, or very little. Oh, what an interesting question. I don't consider it tragic. I think she transcends the tragedy by the strength, the core strength that she has. I don't think she would allow it to be a tragedy. I think it can be seen as a tragedy, and it's certainly, a lot of her life is sad, but she doesn't allow that. She always says, I lived kind of in a time where things were really sad, and it was my job to cheer people up. So I think she saw her role as to uplift people. And then I think she leaves these wonderful legacies. And the tragedy is that Watergate, she doesn't get that due. She doesn't get the credit. And her husband says that, he wishes, she deserved all the praise and the honors and she doesn't get them. But she doesn't care about that. And what she did get was what she called blessed aloneness. And this is the time with her husband at the end, the time with her daughters and her grandchildren. That's what she wanted all along. She would have been happy being a country lawyer's wife. And at the very end of her life, she finally gets that time. And by the way, only does, I believe, there are 2 public events. One public event she does, and then the opening of the Reagan Library and, of course, the Nixon Library. That's it. She doesn't do anymore. So, no, I don't think it's a tragedy. I don't think she would allow it to be a tragedy. That was just not in her nature. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.